Okay. I think I'll jump in. Thank you very much for everyone attending this webinar. My name is Eric Carr. I'm the president of Compose and responsible for our AI team. I'm joined by both Jeff as well as Katie. Spend a little bit more. Jeff will be kind of reviewing some of the lessons learned that we've had around operationalizing AI. I will spend some time kind of really talking through kind of the waves, what we've been seeing in industry over the last few years with the adoption of AI with both some of our clients as well as more broadly in the industry. Um, Myself and Jeff. Jeff is responsible for he's our chief delivery officer, as well as been spending a lot of time in the data space, and also obviously has a lot of implications to a lot of our AI projects. Just pretty quickly for folks that are not familiar with Compose, we're a software development shop. We're really focused on three core pillars, three areas: application development, data engineering, and artificial intelligence. We've been working with our clients across all three of these areas. And we feel like there's a lot of synergies in terms of the capabilities we have and our ability to kind of execute and deliver solutions for our clients. We'll spend definitely a little bit more time around in that third area. So really we've some of the techniques, some of the kind of observations that we have around approaching AI and kind of what we've seen successful for our clients. So there's a few surveys within this presentation. Within Zoom, this should pop up, and feel free to answer. This is really great feedback for us, as we circle back at the end of this webinar. We're happy to kind of share some of those results, as well as kind of have some conversations around that. Within Zoom, there should have been kind of a poll number one popping up, and hopefully it's pretty easy, quick to kind of answer that. Where would you place your organization on the AI adoption journey today? I appreciate the feedback on that, and good for us to just understand where the audience is coming from. So kind of like jumping in, really like thinking about it from a wave standpoint. Really many clients jumped very early on into AI. ChatGPT got released in November 2022. That will kind of come up a few times. It really was kind of a inflection point in the marketplace with AI. It really captured people's imaginations and really began to show what's possible. Since that point in time, there's been a lot of innovation. There's been a lot of adaptation. And what we'd like to talk through is really kind of both what we've seen, some of those lessons learned. How do we help clients or companies that are beginning to think about AI or are along that journey, and hopefully kind of save some time and really provide some focus on what we've seen kind of work well. I like kind of starting with this slide. Obviously, AI has got some big wins and big losses. And I really like this quote where, there really are some pretty spectacular flameouts in terms of what AI is capable of doing, but also, there's some pretty amazing things that you just would not have imagined it doing. And I really do I do think it's fair to kind of consider both of those. Obviously, we really focus on how do we kind of improve, how do we continue to improve the ways that these tools can be used more effectively. And even to some degree, a lot of the fails have become a lot more nuanced. So if you look at as enterprises have been adopting AI, it becomes a little bit more challenging to identify some of those kind of more subtle ways that what they do well and what they don't will do well. But all to say is, I think we try to take a balanced approach as we're looking at adding a new tool to our technology toolkit with AI. There are obviously definitely things that are very, very strong with, but also there's some things that need to be taken into consideration to mitigate the risk, as well as in some cases it's just not very effective in certain types of problems. But all to say, wanted to really start with that. So we definitely really do think AI is going to be game changing, but we also want to kind of keep that in the context that there are things that it's not going to be as effective with. So there's take the good and the bad together and take that in consideration. So a lot of these tech waves, really think about like how do you kind of put it in context historically? And I really liked using this chart because it really kind of puts in context both kind of the slope, so kind of the speed of adoption, as well as kind of where we're at from an adoption curve with AI specifically. And usually, with the internet, I think many of us kind of participated in some ways with kind of the dot-com craziness, the dot crash. and also kind of what came after that. So really, I think a lot of that initial internet investment really created new ways of distributing information, and that really set a lot of the foundation, a lot of the context for a lot of your very successful enterprise internet and SaaS companies today, across the CRM, the ERP, supply chain spaces. And I think in many ways it is a very good parallel to what we're seeing from an AI standpoint. So really, this initial consumer adoption, very heavy on that side, and then over time, this kind of shift towards like really looking at how can the internet enable new processes, new workflows within our business. And we're in a very, very similar point within the AI space. So we'll spend a little bit of time kind of going into specifically AI and the waves that we've seen. And it's kind of an interesting putting this together. The cloud, we're in year 25, year 30 of that wave. And just thinking about the amount of change that's happened in the last 2.5 years, even since like ChatGPT was released, is it's pretty phenomenal. And it's really do we as consultants, as technologists, as business leaders really kind of take advantage of some of these technologies that have just exploded in the last few weeks and the last few months, and kind of take that into consideration as we guide and run our businesses. So just maybe this is a little bit of a throwaway slide, but Google I/O, they just recently had their kind of annual developer conference, and this was one of the slides that just really jumped out to not only me, but like a number of people in industry. Um, Google specifically in the last year has seen over a 50x increase in the amount of AI being used across their properties. Now, obviously, Google is an extremely large company. They have search, they have a lot of their Android mobile, they have a lot of other products. However, I think this is very reflective of kind of what we have been seeing also in industry, that there's just continues to be an acceleration in the interest in AI as well as the proliferation of it across multiple services. I think the other thing of note is, especially just going this year, and this, I do think there are other data points that tell a very similar story. We have seen somewhat of an acceleration in 2025. So we won't spend as much time in kind of Q1 of 2025. Really wanted to kind of highlight more during this presentation, what happened in 2023, what happened in 2024. But I did want to highlight that there really has been an uptick in activity, in interest, in more real use cases of AI over the last few months. And it's again, like we're talking probably a 5x increase, 5 to 6 increase over the last few months. And that's something that, how do you think about that change? How do you manage from an enterprise standpoint the risks as well as the potential of something that's so explosive? So this is a slide that I think I like using because it really provides the historical context, and I think similar to kind of framing the internet really changed the way made distribution of information free. I think very similarly what we're seeing with AI and why I think people are so excited about it is really changing the cost, the economics of like kind of the written word. So ARK Investment created this chart. They really looked back over the last century, so really trying to keep that kind of historical context in mind. And really, the cost of the written word, so paying someone to write 1,000 words, has been pretty consistent. There's been a little bit of increase, a little decrease, but you see this drastic, 2, 3, 4 orders of magnitude reduction in the cost of the written word with the introduction of these large language models. Secondarily, there's also a much pretty significant capability within there. So it's not only just kind of more cost effective, but you're also seeing a pretty significant explosion in the capabilities of these underlying models. And this is a chart that shows a little bit of the kind of competitive landscape. I think it's definitely multiple players. OpenAI is clearly kind of the leader from a consumer brand standpoint within AI space, but Google, Meta, Anthropic, there's a number of other players in this space that continue to kind of leapfrog each other and kind of continuing to kind of push the space forward. And really on the bottom, won't really go into it too much, but there's really pretty significant changing going on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis for these models. So we've seen not only kind of a pretty competitive landscape across multiple players, but also we've seen pretty significant improvements from a multimodal capability. So, Katie and I were talking before this call. If you have not tried some of the music generation capabilities, some of these models with very limited information, it's pretty amazing what they can do. There's been a really significant push from a reasoning standpoint. We'll get into that a little bit more later. Open source has been a huge trend, but really these are pretty fundamental capabilities that continue to make pretty material progress. And we kind of, at least to date, have not seen it slowing down. I think people are becoming even more creative, working around constraints, trying to provide more value, provide more capabilities to users of these models. So. And then just kind of bringing together both the cost side as well as the capability. This chart is really somewhat trying to reflect on the y-axis. So the left-hand side is really benchmark scores. So it's kind of like you could view it as a capability. It's one of the more common benchmarks that are used for large language models. On the x-axis, on the bottom is really cost. And what you see is like kind of a shift towards the upper right. And that's kind of representative of kind of reduction in costs as well as increase in capabilities. And some of the two boxes in green kind of just really highlighting two pretty impressive changes in the last few months, year and a half, where that GPT level of intelligence, so that same capability that got released in March of 2023, we now, a year and a half later, can have the same capabilities for around 1,000x less cost. And just given that amount of change, I think we're still beginning to think about how can we actually incorporate that into the types of use cases, that enables you to do different things. Like a lot of that intelligence is becoming effectively, free in many ways. The other one is up on the upper left-hand side. So there's been a lot of focus on reasoning models. So how do these models go beyond probably more of the chat-based interactions, and how do I use it for process work? How do I use it for coding? And those costs have also significantly reduced over the last 3 to 4 months. So DeepSeek created a lot of interest and a lot of momentum earlier this year in February with the release of their DeepSeek R1. That has not slowed down. Since that point in time, Google as well as OpenAI have released new models. They continue to drive the cost curves down. And then, as users, as builders of some of these AI systems, there's just this really great set of capabilities that continue to not only get better, but also more cost effective. So there's a larger class of problems that you can kind of actually tackle, given this kind of very strong trend. So with that, like we really like thinking about, like what are the use cases? So now, hopefully you have some appreciation for how quickly this space is evolving, as well as the usage is accelerating. What are people doing with that? And, I think this McKinsey analysis is one that we like using, really kind of highlighting some of the key areas within a lot of enterprises that are, what is being adopted. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on going through each one of the different waves. But really sales and marketing and kind of software engineering are kind of in a cluster themselves. I think that there clearly is a lot of potential, and as well as there's a lot of investment in trying to improve both those functions and leveraging AI. And then there's obviously another cluster in the bottom middle, customer care, R&D, supply chain, finance operations. Those are all very significant, large opportunities in and of themselves. However, sales and marketing and engineering seem to have a lot more acceleration, a lot more potential than some of these other areas. But companies are really tackling all of them in many ways. So again, this is beginning to kind of set the context on where some of these areas began, but also secondarily where a lot of the analysts are forecasting the long-term benefits, the long-term value creation of AI, and where that's going to accrue. So I think kind of with that in mind, we see a lot of focus on different types of business value. We're big proponents of really starting with what are some of the more fundamental business challenges within a business to solve with AI first. And a lot of the analysis, and we'll be going through some of the use cases, really focus on increasing productivity. So there's pretty heavy interest in kind of enhancing customer experience, driving digital transformation, improving revenue, reducing costs. However, in general, I think what people are finding is increasing productivity, speeding what you're able to do today, automating some of the capabilities or the manual tasks that happen today is really where the vast majority of technologists are really beginning to focus more and more on, and beginning to see more and more value from the adoption of AI technologies. So hopefully that kind of gives you some appreciation of kind of the broader, the broader macro trends within AI. And, the next is really kind of what we wanted to dig into as we kind of step back and reflect on what's happened over the last 2.5 years. There's kind of really four different waves that AI has been adopted. So, really wanted to spend a little bit more time on each one of these. The first wave was really experimentation and awareness. As I mentioned, that really was kind of launched and predicated on ChatGPT being released in November 2022, and a very, very dynamic few months, the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. There's this wave two within like the mid 2023, where there's really an enterprise awakening. So as there's pretty significant explosive adoption in the consumer space with ChatGPT, businesses began to think about how do you go adopt these technologies? How do you do it in an effective way? How do you do it in a secure, way to protect the data assets, the intellectual property that exists? And, wanted to kind of talk through some of the lessons learned as well as kind of experience with that. This wave three gets a little bit more fuzzy, but towards the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, there was a huge explosion in platform wars. So there's a significant amount of funding going into the space. There's a lot of new builders, new AI startups that are being created, as well as kind of a shift a little bit from an enterprise AI strategy where there was more kind of overall company strategies around AI. Versus kind of these point things. So I think really a lot of wave two was more focused on these very small experiments. How do you learn very quickly? And began to see at least some maturation, some kind of more formalization of some of the strategies during that wave three. And then wave four, maybe April or mid 2025 to today, wanted to kind of spend more time on what's happening. So we've been seeing a lot more integration of AI across enterprises, it being really viewed as a way of transforming parts of the business that already exist, and wanted to kind of talk through some of the observations there. And I kind of wanted to share on the bottom left, it's in kind of the field of cognitive development, as with a lot of AI, many of these things are trying to mirror how people process things, but really like this notion of like kind of overlapping waves. So obviously we're going to try to segment it out, but the reality is there's a number of waves going on. So given, in the multimedia space, given the reasoning space, given the capabilities of these large language models, we're really looking at multiple waves, and just wanted to at least give some appreciation that in some cases these might be overlapping. And also the reality is most companies are at different parts of their AI journey, and different techniques, different strategies might be more effective based upon where they're at today. So kind of jumping into wave one. So as I mentioned, that was like kind of that experimentation and awareness wave, really starting in kind of towards the end of 2022 and the first quarter of 2023. And it's really, not really that hard to kind of think through what it involved, but it was, it's really was predicated on ChatGPT. So ChatGPT was one of the fastest services ever to get to 1 million users, to 100 million users. I think it got to 1 million users within like 6 days. It got to 100 million users within 2 months. So really significant growth. And at least putting it within context, it really did not necessarily come out of nowhere. So I think the bottom left-hand side, I think is informative. OpenAI had been around, since 2017, 2018, and really building these models. And GPT 3.5 was really kind of the foundation of what was the capabilities within ChatGPT. And really, when they launched ChatGPT in 3.5 in March of 2022, they didn't necessarily see the usage that they wanted. So as with many things, getting more data, getting more usage patterns is really, really valuable in terms of improving the service. And one of their approaches was releasing a chatbot to be able to drive more API traffic, so they'd be able to kind of tune and build these models more. So really, I think in some ways, kind of happenstance, I think probably the largest transformation in technology of our generation was motivated by wanting to get more data and being able to kind of release this new model to interact, give a better, easier, and better way for people to interact with some of these AI technologies. And here we are, 2.5 years later. So I don't know. This was something like there was a little bit of a debate, maybe probably a little bit more in the techie circles around like the fastest service to 100 million users. I don't know if people remember like Pokemon Go. It went to 100 million users twice as fast as ChatGPT. If people remember back to the summer of 2016, I believe. And I think the main reason I bring it up is I think, these numbers of like, 100 million, a billion get thrown around. We don't necessarily have an appreciation of like how pervasive some of these technologies are. And I still have these like very distinct memories of like Pokemon Go. When it got to 100 million users, there were people walking around wherever in like public parks, like using these tools. And that mental model like kind of sticks with me. So as you think about how pervasive ChatGPT got within 2 months, I just had that mental model of, people using Pokemon Go and just how pervasive it became within our culture. Um, so just pretty quickly, some of the initial use cases, like this is a little bit of a smattering, but I think it's somewhat representative. So during that end of 2022, early 2023, these were the types of use cases that people were experimenting with and ones that were a little bit more high profile. So, I think, Allen and Overy is a pretty large law firm. Harvey is a pretty well-known startup within the AI legal space. And there was a very early announcements of a very large law, a leading law firm using some of the AI technologies for drafting of legal documents. Obviously, it's progressed a lot more from there, but I think at least began to hint at the ability of kind of dealing with multiple documents, being able to synthesize that, being able to kind of cross compare, and that's something that I think was very much driven in those early days from a legal standpoint there. There was a lot of work on the marketing side. So there was a lot of early experimentation of kind of creating ad copy. What's interesting is a number of kind of marketing agencies were not necessarily very transparent about using it. But, I think in retrospect, many of them came out like really were very, very quick adopters in experimenting with ChatGPT to be able to kind of generate, marketing campaigns, ideas. That ideation side was very, very valuable. Coca-Cola had a really fun campaign pretty in the same time period, leveraging, ChatGPT got released, I think, March of 2023, and Dolly, which is OpenAI's image generation. So they really had kind of this viral marketing content campaign and really leaned into how do you actually kind of both, leverage the brand as well as leverage some of these new tools and kind of the social media around that. So there was a lot of early experimentations around how do you go do kind of some interesting content generation with AI. Walmart, probably no surprise, was pretty early on trying to leverage it to help manage its suppliers. So they ran, I think, somewhat of a, maybe it flew maybe a little bit under the radar, but it was pretty effective. So they ran, leveraged some of these AI technologies to kind of really target some of their smaller suppliers. So these are the ones that are actually supplying products to Walmart, so not necessarily to end users, and really from a supplier negotiation standpoint. And they were able to kind of show some pretty quick wins in terms of renegotiating some of the contracts, like extending kind of the days, the account receivables, payables kind of thing. And it was kind of a very early example where automating for some of these companies at significant scale, interacting with some of their supply network, you could find very, very effective ways of leveraging AI to kind of really help in managing costs and kind of operational efficiencies. And also, I think we saw very early on adoption of some of the technologies, within other products. So Bing is an example. People might remember Bard that Google released. It since has been rebranded as Gemini. But we saw a lot of experimentation. The reality is a lot of misses with a lot of these large technology companies. But we saw like there was significant interest. There was a perception that there was pretty large threats to the search business to others, and we saw a lot of interesting kind of early experiments during this wave with some of those technologies. So kind of like stepping back in this wave one. So again, in that late 2022, early 23, period, these are kind of at least three areas or four areas that we really looked at, like what actually happened, as well as some of the lessons learned. And obviously, hopefully, this is applicable. If people are beginning their AI journey or still very early on, I think a lot of these learnings are still very, very applicable. So I think the reality is, I think the growth in AI really took a lot of companies by surprise. I think many of them were not necessarily ready for it. It did lead to a lot of high profile, interesting kind of IP leakage, compliance issues. I think in the next point, I think there's a lot of court cases. This is one of the examples where a lot of these large language models just make up stuff. So they're looking at patterns in the data as opposed to actually facts. And I think there was a need to kind of get used to how these models operated and take into consideration that just because a ChatGPT or some model is actually stating something, understanding where that information is coming from and putting it in the appropriate context. So I think we also saw a lot of awareness that there was a large component of human oversight and fact checking. So obviously, these large language models were very, very effective at kind of initial capabilities, but they were not necessarily production ready. So kind of at least beginning to hint at some of those phenomenal business, but then just these spectacular fails. How do we actually really leverage and play to the strengths of these large language models, as well as opposed to trying to use them in areas that didn't make sense? I think a lot of the strategic side, so aligning experiments with the business value, I think it really probably started out a little bit more like a shiny object. So there were a lot of ad hoc efforts. There weren't a ton of like frameworks in place, obviously, just given how quickly it was running or like growing. But then there was beginning to be a shift towards how do you go identify some of these high impact kind of pilot use cases. So kind of back to some of those examples, a lot of it was more focused on content generation. How do I use chat to kind of ideate? How do I use it to summarize data? Beginning to put the foundation in place. How do I go do more effective large changes for my business leveraging AI? So we did see quite a bit of like kind of like kitchen sink AI use case analysis. I think a lot of companies kind of built these lists of a few dozen, a few hundred use cases, and then really struggled with like what do you do next? And I think just beginning to have this focus on kind of higher impact use cases was, I think, a good way of kind of dealing with that. And then also, from a behavioral standpoint, so excitement. I think there was a lot of early excitement, but obviously skepticism, the need to really kind of show what this actually can do and really kind of building up confidence of that. And I think what we saw, some of the leading companies, as well as with the companies that we worked with, really openly sharing kind of the AI results of these experiments, good or bad, and really kind of some of the lessons learned on the bad side were really help, inform, where are the key areas to kind of focus on kind of going forward. So it's all to say, cross-organizational, technical, strategic, and behavioral. These are some of the kind of those key insights, those key learnings that many companies in this initial kind of wave one, time period really learned and kind of, I think, benefited from and put better foundations in place as we kind of shifted into kind of wave two. So I think wave one was really kind of, I think, mainly, representative of like kind of kicking the tires. So a lot of, especially specifically in the enterprise space, they're beginning to think about how you can actually apply that. And, I think one way of kind of representing that is I kind of like these charts. One is on the upper left-hand side is really an analysis of S&P 500 earnings calls. So how much AI was mentioned. So we're looking at, it spiked, 3 to 4x within a relatively short period of time, very much driven by ChatGPT. So I think companies began to recognize that AI could potentially be a game changer for their businesses and began to both, within an earning call standpoint, as well as kind of annual report, pretty large spike in the mentioning of, AI within those documents. And again, this is in that middle of 2023 kind of time period. So we began to see, during this wave two experience, kind of a split between functional use cases as well as industry. So these specific ones are more kind of by function. So we very quickly saw kind of an alignment across these 3 areas. So I think the first adoption, I think, really was driven by customer service. So kind of this, exploration of like chatbots, virtual agents, trying to do sentiment analysis and a lot of call centers, like how do you go improve that? And also kind of trying to figure out how do you go do more personalized support. So this was, I think, really for in many cases, like the top generative AI priority, some really, really powerful kind of quick wins in terms of reducing, mean time to kind of handle tickets, to handle calls. But like customer service continues to be one of the areas where we're seeing a lot of success, both from there's a lot of great platforms and applications out there, but also a number of clients are kind of doing more custom work in this space. Marketing sales, and mentioned earlier, is another area where we're continue to see a lot of innovation, but specifically in this 2023 period, saw a really explosion in the use for content creation, market data analysis, customer segmentation, personalized outreach, and I think that's probably reflected in a lot of people's more creative email outreach approaches that were being pinged by, and really saw a pretty large adoption. And this is not really slowing down. People are continuing to figure out how do you most effectively leverage some of these AI technologies across marketing and sales. And then from a software development standpoint, won't spend as much time on this, but from a code generation, debugging, automated testing, I think really a lot of the software development cycles, things began to get its legs in that middle 2023 time period, and it's just kind of accelerated from there. So and then kind of splitting, shifting to more of an industry bent. So these were, some of the industries that, in that, again, that same time period really kind of looked at AI and began to adopt. And there's kind of some reported benefits, ROIs. Many of these are kind of public case use cases. So, they were kind of self-reported in many ways, but finance very aggressively adopted it for kind of market intelligence. How do you provide kind of more personalized guidance to your employees, but obviously, involved a lot of guardrails. Healthcare, I think probably an overemphasis on more of the operational side. Obviously, I think there's a lot of work from a diagnosis assistant standpoint, so kind of really more of a co-pilot model, being able to think about new wellness or treatment plans, and then I think from a virtual health assistant standpoint is a pretty popular area, but those are the areas where healthcare is really kind of beginning to kind of scale out, just given that there's a lot of opportunities from an automation standpoint. Retail consumer goods, similarly, personalized recommendations, inventory management, education, and manufacturing. But again, this is kind of somewhat representative of how each one of these industries were beginning to kind of identify some of the key challenges within their businesses, and then really looking at ways that how AI could actually help affect positive change in those areas. So I think very similarly for these wave two areas, I think what we saw is a lot of, these pilots going to more playbooks. So a lot of companies were looking at how do they take the learnings from these initial experiments and really kind of drive it out across the overall organization. And that began to get more into what are the implications to the cloud infrastructure, what are the implications to data, what are the implications for the security postures for many of these companies. And that's something that we saw, accelerate during this time period. I think at this point, we also saw a lot of more integration points, challenges. So like we looked at, how do you leverage these new AI tools with proprietary data? I think the response quality and accuracy became a lot more critical, given that you were kind of driving this into core business functions, as well as kind of controlling costs became some of the thing. And, along with kind of the integration pain points, really, how do you keep up with the space? So as this technology continued to evolve very, very quickly, how do you make sure that you're not necessarily betting on a vendor or technology that's going to disappear in a few months? So how do you build these more robust architectures, to be able to kind of address that? Quick wins and ROI became more key, so nothing kind of really surprising there, but really more of a focus on employee productivity as well as customer satisfaction, as well as kind of a pretty significant focus on user adoption and trust. So how do you help employees think about AI as a benefit to their business, as well as leveraging customers, improving the customer experience? So I still feel like there's a little bit of a bifurcation in the market. I think there's still like fear, but there's also, I think, a lot of potential benefits, and many companies leaned into trying to figure out how do they go proactively manage expectations, work with their employees to really understand what AI can do, and that puts them in a much better position from a trust standpoint. So kind of like jumping into wave three. So this was really kind of the end of 2023, 24. Won't spend as much time like specifically kind of going into details around what happened during this one. But really, I think what we saw generally was a lot of platform wars, a lot of the AI technologies, or a lot of the large companies made pretty significant investments, huge explosion in the amount of investment, as well as kind of a shift towards those early experiments, those early playbooks really becoming more AI strategies across a lot of these companies. So really, I think somewhat representative of this area is really around the investments. So I think no surprise to anyone, 2023 and even going into 2024, pretty significant investments in AI, really driven by the infrastructure side. Obviously, a lot of these new use cases were requiring more compute from NVIDIA and the other AI infrastructure providers. So that by far kind of dominated from a spend standpoint. However, we began to see kind of a lot more investment in kind of like horizontal applications and vertical applications. So, at least from a deal flow standpoint, it got above, what the 2019, 2020 kind of norms were from that. And kind of in that mind, I won't spend too much on this, but really, kind of just specifically focusing on from a vertical and horizontal, that's really where we began to see a lot more innovation, a lot more experiences, because this was really where kind of a lot of companies were kind of touching AI. So obviously, some were kind of building from the raw components, but really these vertical and horizontal solutions were really where the main touch points were from a lot of these companies. And this chart on the right, kind of really jumped out, like really, and some of it is indicative of what you can do with AI. I think a lot of people are feeling you can really help accelerate what you're able to do with much smaller teams. So, I think this really kind of spelled out during the 2000 to 2010, there were a lot of really positive, successful companies that were more human powered from a digital platform standpoint. During the 2010 to 2020, we saw a lot more product led companies. Now we're seeing companies of 20, 30, 50, less than 100 people generating more than $100 million in revenue. And I think this is very much indicative of what the leverage models that you can get out of leveraging AI for some of these specific capabilities, as well as just how phenomenal like some of these early startups are from a revenue growth standpoint is. So some of the learnings here, like top-down direction and company-wide engagement. So during this wave week three period, I think we began to see a lot more kind of executive sponsorship as well as a clear strategy driven across the organization. So really trying to look at how to kind of unwind some of the shadow AI that had kind of evolved during wave two. Scalability and safety became really critical, kind of two pillars. So both from a scalability as this continues to get driven out to a broader part of organizations. How do you do that in a cost-effective and kind of scalable manner? And then secondarily, obviously, a lot of the safety. So as more proprietary data got interwoven with some of these AI solutions, how do you have both kind of the right systems in place? How do you have the right talent in place to be able to manage that? I think from a strategic standpoint, there was definitely more focus on kind of shifting to long-term value and differentiation. So, where is AI's role in the broader vision, and like how does it help and spur kind of continuous innovation? And then obviously also like from a behavioral standpoint, the workforce transition and adoption at scale, continued focus on what is like the human plus AI focus, and how does that help kind of accelerate and improve the way that people do business. So with that, I might be running a little bit behind, but just wanted to quickly throw out this survey question if people were interested in answering. So, what have been your biggest challenges with AI adoption so far? And just be interested in the survey results on that. So going through just kind of the wave four, I think no surprise, I think this was a survey by Gartner towards the end of last year. Really, like, what are the new technologies? AI is number one, and that is continuing to trend up. And I think that gives us a lot of conviction that AI is continuing to going to be kind of a game changer for a lot of companies and how they're leveraging these technologies in many ways. I might skip this next slide. But what I wanted to really highlight was right now, over the last few months, really a lot of things are talking about the agentic workforce, and we're beginning to see kind of a little bit more of a focus on skeuomorphic roles. So as we look at kind of taking a lot of the AI learnings and knowledge that have been accumulated over the last 2+ years, how do we actually specifically focus it on kind of more work focused, task focused kind of operations within companies? And there's been this pretty large explosion in a lot of startups that are focused on this areas. And how do you think about some of the core functions within a company, and how do you go help accelerate? How do you augment what people are doing today with some of these kind of agentic capabilities? So kind of some of the things that we're beginning to we're seeing more and more now is, like how do you do continuous adaptation and as well as industry learning? I think understanding what's happening in the marketplace, getting best practices is really critical because just given how quickly some of the technologies are evolving, there's a lot of domain specific innovation. So I think there's a little bit of a shift more towards like away from these horizontal platforms to more vertical. So how do I really take advantage of the expertise and knowledge of my business, and really leverage kind of AI technology suited for that versus just kind of these one size fit all type approaches. I think we're beginning to see more business model shifts, competitive shifts, as well as I do think there's these more macro conversations going on, like where AI fits within the workforce impact, and really focusing companies or asking companies to be very proactive and we're really managing that kind of impact to people. So kind of wrapping up, I think this kind of is indicative of like kind of the early adopters. So we have like these fast moving industries. You have like your technology companies, no real surprise. Financial services has definitely been an early adopter of a lot of these technologies, media and telecom. So really both from a content standpoint as well as customer interactions, as well as kind of professional services. So these are really ones that I think were very early on in wave one and have continued to kind of drive a lot of innovation, a lot of lessons learned that can benefit other industries. We did see a number of so retail, manufacturing, healthcare, education kind of jump in during that wave two, wave three. So during parts of 23 going into 2024, and really kind of adopting very specific use cases for their business. So I think these early adopters were probably a little bit more broad in terms of the AI capabilities, just given where the market was at. And then, we began to see a shift in that area. And then, today, public sector, government, and also like kind of other safety critical fields, we do see much slower adoption of AI within these areas. So this is kind of somewhat representative and really trying to figure out how do you continue to take the lessons learned from some of these early adopters, as well as kind of drive that into companies that are just beginning to think about adopting AI today. So just kind of wrapping up the waves, I think these are kind of buckets both at a human level, at an enterprise level, as well as kind of a strategic level that, kind of summarize what we're seeing the best organizations doing, as well as how we would recommend kind of taking advantage of what's in front of people from an AI standpoint. So I think there really is a very much of a people element. How do you augment what they're doing? It's not really a replacement. I think trust and transparency is very critical. Human in the loop has become kind of a buzzword or a term. How do you continue to have people as part of some of these critical decisions, as well as how do you upscale your teams? We're also seeing a lot more, merging of like kind of the top-down strategy and bottoms-up experimentation. So you really want to have guidance from the top in terms of what are the objectives, what are the goals of AI, but also you want to maintain that experimentation, that flexibility to really kind of experiment with different concepts within organizations. First mover probably doesn't matter as much as more kind of fast iteration and learnings. I think we're seeing a lot of companies, with small wins really scale those up. So really starting small and growing. I do think there's a pretty large conversation around like where junior employees, middle management fit within this. Obviously, I think a lot of junior employees are being most impacted by what these AI capabilities are able to manually automate, or manual tasks that they're able to automate. But really, like there's a role. How do you leverage these technologies to kind of move up the value chain, do more impactful work? And then from a AI model standpoint, models are commoditizing. So the reality is the value is not necessarily as much with what model is used, but like how are they being used? And really, a lot of these AI capabilities are really amplifying what exists today. And I think from a context data layering standpoint, Jeff is going to be talking a little bit more about that. But that's really critical to be able to kind of extract value from this. So overall, hopefully this gives you an appreciation of some of the waves, some of the lessons learned, some of the challenges, as well as the reality this space is not slowing down. So I think a lot of what we're focused on doing is like, how do we both help clients kind of begin to adopt AI, as well as plan for the fact that this is going to be kind of growing exponentially ongoing. So one last question before jumping over to Jeff and kind of going into more detail from an operational standpoint. Um, which areas of your business are you targeting for AI implementation in 2025? And there should be a nice Zoom survey kind of pop up for that. So with that, hand it over to Jeff.
All right. Thanks, Eric. So I'm going to talk about how to operationalize the AI ecosystem. We did get a couple questions, so thank you for the questions. I will attempt to answer those here as I'm talking. Some of you mentioned needing a data strategy as one of your biggest challenges, or being concerned about security. So we're also going to touch on some of those critical aspects as well in the last 10 minutes here. So if you go to the next slide, for those of you who have heard us talk about AI before, we like to recommend this approach for rolling out AI. And critically on the left there is getting some vision and strategy and use cases out the door so that you can build momentum, you can get your organization excited about AI. And really the focus of what I'm going to talk about is once you're past that, right? Eric mentioned the waves. We're in wave 4 out of 4 right now, and I'm sure there'll be more waves to come, but we're really going to focus on the right side of the chart here. So once you have gotten that adoption, once you have built some momentum, how do you go start weaving in this technology, the security and privacy? One of the questions that Mahir asked was, how do you go integrate this into existing workflows, right? Is it rip and replace, or do they live side by side? Where do you get the data that you're going to use to like train your internal systems? How do you grow your skills and capabilities? So that's what we're going to briefly introduce here today. So if you go to the next slide, just wanted to set a little bit of context about what it means to talk about enterprise AI. So if you're thinking about individual use cases, it's fairly easy to say, okay, here, I'm going to use ChatGPT, I'm going to build agents to solve specific problems. But plugging into an enterprise context means you'd have to take a look at the bottom of your stack, which is your source systems, your data foundation, your platforms, your existing workflows, you've invested so much in your IT and data infrastructure over the years. Getting that plugged in into the AI context is very critical. Next up, building those capabilities and specializing those capabilities towards AI. So this is where you can get really innovative. The interesting thing about AI, all of us know, as Eric was saying, AI has been around for 30, 40 years. If you take a look at like reporting and business intelligence, that uses AI. If you take a look at AI and machine learning, those uses AI. If you take a look at operational data, these are some of the ways that your data can start to live and grow. And so plugging these AI capabilities into that data context is very, very important. And then most of you, the winning answer for what are you most concerned about is that identification and implementation of valuable use cases. So there's a couple listed here. This is a chart by McKinsey to just recommend some ideation. Eric covered most of these already, but we'll talk a little bit more about this. So if you go to the next slide, there's a critical order of operations here that I think during those waves 1 and 2, people really jumped into the use cases. And I think now there's a big effort to go back and understand, how do we go build these enterprise capabilities? And you have to kind of start at step 1 here, which is really to discover and understand data. Organizations have been struggling with this problem for years and years. This is not new. But sadly, for all of us who might want to just jump right into AI, this is a critical foundational step. The other second thing that AI is actually really good at doing is helping us create and summarize content. And so not only then understanding what the data is, but creating and summarizing it and tagging it and cataloging the data that we have available can be a really helpful step then to then go and integrate that into our data stack and our data capabilities and to go build new stuff on top of it. And then, of course, thirdly, is the stuff we all want to get to, which is then how do we go automate business processes. So I'll briefly go through each of these here over the next 3 slides. You go forward. Here's the question. If you don't know where your data lives or what it means, how can AI? And I attached this chart from that. This is just a Microsoft organizational capability view. And I'm not going to go through the details, but what it shows is that data ecosystems are complicated, right? So on the top, you have all of your business functions. In the middle, you have all of your productivity tools, your data services, your platforms. On the bottom, you have your cloud infrastructure. So we're not touting Microsoft, here, but no matter what stack you use, this is a rough representation of what you're in for. And understanding your data in this space is complicated, right? There's a whole, if you're familiar with DAMA, which is a data management framework out there, there's disciplines that have been around forever that have been trying to provide pathways and guidance of how to go make this possible. And it really boils down to identify the data, cataloging the data, and classifying the data. And I'm not going to go into these just in the interest of time, but the sad thing for all of us here is AI can be a good assistant at, tagging, anomaly detection, metadata extraction, things like that. But unfortunately here, data governance best practices is really the way to accomplish this. And so a lot of the times our customers will come to us and we'll start talking about, adapting AI. And it is really important to take a step back and say, all right, how is your data governance? How is your data processes? How is your data architecture in general? Because that's going to lead a lot better success and a lot better results for your organization. So if you go to the next one, once you get there, this is a picture of, okay, how can you use all this data to your advantage? And here I asked a couple questions in the chat here. So where do adopters get their training data? If you look at the bottom there, you have a ton of data in your organization. So your enterprise systems, whether that's your ERP, your manufacturing systems, your logistics platforms, your health information systems, you name it. You have a bunch of third-party data that you might be bringing in, but these unstructured data is really where the potential and the opportunity lies for LLMs and for generative AI technologies to really unlock that and bring it into that data context, right? So if you're moving up the stack, you have your data integration, your data governance pillars, your modern data platforms, and all of this is serving those enterprise data use cases, right? And so building in those content solutions for AI, using RAG to plug into your databases and your data stores to understand what data do I even have and how can I make sense of it and how can I use it. We use deep research here at Compose Labs to recommend use cases. And hey, given this context, given all of my data, what would be some very valuable areas to use AI for good and for operational effectiveness? Well, guess what? Getting that context and that framework spun up in your organization can lead to data-driven insights about, hey, where should I go apply AI to make sense? And deep research capabilities are very strong to be able to do that. And then basically semantic linking. So what that means is we already are, I'm sure, very familiar with hey, my CRM thinks of customer this way. My ERP thinks of customer this way. Well, guess what? Now I can look at all my emails, my files, and I can get a much better picture and use AI to help me understand what really does a customer mean across my organization. And that can really help illuminate, but then help build these capabilities towards, towards the top of the architecture here. So if you go forward one more, this one I really think is interesting because we think about, okay, how can AI make the biggest impact of my organization? Well, as Eric said earlier, the making people more effective and efficient at their jobs is a substantial impact, right? And so a lot of the times when we build departmental AI solutions, we built a couple departmental AI solutions where we're trying to take requirements from 10 parties and build these complicated agents to go solve this problem. The solution really becomes watered down. And so a really good suggestion is to think about what are real people doing in the organization in a day-to-day, and build agentic automation for that particular problem, and then get their feedback and iterate from there. And so if you look at this chart that I really like, it's how do we enable employees to move up that AI employee journey. If you look at kind of some of the ones on the right side, AI first, AI evangelist, this is where that adoption in your organization will really start to take off if you can get folks in there. So it might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but really starting by coming up with use cases that are going to help individual humans on your team solve specific problems. It's a really good way to really rapidly get the people then to be more democratizing AI, if you want to think about it in that way. Let's see, we're about at time, so maybe if you go forward, Eric. Security is hugely important, and I'm not going to go through all of the details. Stay tuned. Maybe we'll spin up another webinar for security, but these are some really critical things that you're going to need to do that fall under kind of that data governance pillar. And the nice thing about security is AI has become very good at supporting a lot of these things. So threat modeling and data access, making sure that you're building role-based access controls, making sure that you're basically integrating the AI ecosystem into your broader security ecosystem, right? So the compliance and regulatory, setups, it's easy when you can deploy a data center out to the EU or deploy a HIPAA compliant data center. Some of those things are easy, but if you're trying to spread AI capabilities across those horizontal AI capabilities that Eric was mentioning, it can become a little bit more challenging. So making sure that you're just, again, integrating those AI capabilities in with the rest of your architecture is very critical. And then really taking an operational view of security. I think we've operationalized security pretty well, just from a normal kind of enterprise capability function, right? Your data integration, your data storage, your application ecosystem. So plugging in AI into that operationalization context is very important. And a lot of the times, the reason we're mentioning this so much is because a lot of the times people have been building these rapid use cases on AI, and you just want to make sure that you're able to plug this in to the rest of your organization. So I think I'll wrap up with this picture, and I know we're 1 minute over, but I showed a different version of this picture earlier, but taking a look at this holistic architecture is just the critical way to make sure that AI is one of many capabilities, and building the foundational pieces below are very critical, right? So again, we probably have enough content for all of these different components of the architecture to spin up a whole webinar on this. If folks are interested, maybe we will do that. But really, to answer one of the questions that we got, we're not ripping and replacing capabilities here, but going and embedding AI into data governance, into data integration, into modern data platforms, and then specializing on top of that to get your AI stores, your vector stores, your APIs, your use cases all integrated across with AI. This is the way that we're seeing companies really go and adapt and drive positive change to their whole ecosystem. So I'll stop there since we're over time. But thank you all for joining, and we really appreciate you listening. And we'll send out the recording here to you all.